If Venezuela fell, how a U.S. power move could reshape the global order. Introduction. A world on edge. In global politics, power rarely moves quietly. History teaches us that one decision made at the right moment, by the right actor, can alter alliances, destabilize regions, and reshape the world for generations. Borders shift, markets react, ideologies collide. Now imagine a hypothetical scenario, a dramatic escalation involving the United States and Venezuela. A moment where American power directly intervenes in one of the most fragile political crises in the Western Hemisphere. Imagine a world in which former U.S. President Donald Trump, through extraordinary political or international circumstances, removes Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro from power and places Venezuela under direct U.S. influence. This is not a prediction. It is not an endorsement. It is a geopolitical thought experiment. But it is one worth examining, because such an event would not remain confined to Venezuela. It would ripple across Latin America, disrupt global energy markets, and test the limits of international law and sovereignty. In this video essay, we explore how such a scenario could redraw geopolitical boundaries, escalate global tensions, and redefine what power means in the modern world. Part 1. Venezuela. A state under sustained collapse. To understand why Venezuela sits at the center of this hypothetical, we must understand its prolonged crisis. Venezuela was once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations. Its vast oil reserves funded social programs, infrastructure, and regional influence. But years of mismanagement, corruption, and political centralization eroded that foundation. Under Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela experienced hyperinflation, chronic shortages of food and medicine, collapsing public services, mass migration on a historic scale. Millions of Venezuelans left the country, fleeing economic desperation and political repression. Yet despite this collapse, Maduro remained in power. How? Through three reinforcing pillars. First, military loyalty. Second, institutional control. Third, international backing. Russia, China, and Iran offered financial, diplomatic, and strategic support. Turning Venezuela into more than a domestic crisis, it became a node in global power competition. Any foreign intervention would therefore be about far more than regime change. It would be about influence. Part 2. Trump, Venezuela, and the politics of confrontation. Donald Trump's foreign policy style was unconventional. It favored leverage over diplomacy, pressure over consensus, and visibility over subtlety. Venezuela occupied a unique place in that worldview. During Trump's presidency, the United States imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, financial institutions, and political elites. The administration openly challenged Maduro's legitimacy and supported opposition leadership. Trump himself spoke publicly about Venezuela's oil wealth and framed the crisis as both a humanitarian disaster and a strategic concern. While no direct intervention occurred, the rhetoric mattered, because rhetoric shapes expectations, and expectations shape global behavior. This hypothetical scenario does not arise from fantasy. It emerges from real tensions that already existed. Part 3. A hypothetical turning point. Now imagine a sudden geopolitical rupture. Maduro is removed from power under extraordinary international circumstances. A new government emerges with explicit U.S. backing. Washington gains unprecedented influence over Venezuelan institutions. The immediate effects would be destabilizing. Venezuela is deeply divided. Some citizens might welcome change after years of suffering. Others would view it as foreign domination. Political factions would clash. Social tensions would intensify. Questions of legitimacy would dominate public life. But the most significant consequences would unfold beyond Venezuela's borders. Part 4. Latin America and historical memory. Latin America carries a long memory of foreign intervention. From the Cold War era to the late 20th century, the region experienced coups, proxy conflicts, and covert interference. A U.S.-driven power shift in Venezuela would resurrect those memories. Governments across the region would be forced to respond. Some might quietly support the move, especially those opposed to Maduro's ideology. Others would condemn it as a violation of sovereignty. Regional unity would fracture. Organizations designed to promote cooperation could weaken or collapse under ideological strain. Public opinion would polarize. The result would not be clarity, but division. Part 5. The global stage. Great power reactions. Venezuela is not geopolitically isolated. Russia and China have invested heavily in the country's energy, infrastructure, and political survival. A U.S.-dominated Venezuela would be interpreted as a direct challenge to those interests. Russia could respond asymmetrically through diplomacy, cyber pressure, or military signaling elsewhere. China could respond economically, leveraging trade relationships, or accelerating efforts to build alternative global systems. This would not resemble a traditional war. It would resemble a multi-domain standoff, where power is exercised through influence, finance, technology, and narrative. The United Nations would likely become paralyzed. Security Council resolutions would stall. Diplomatic credibility would erode. The global order would feel less stable. Part 6. International law and the question of sovereignty. At the heart of this scenario lies a fundamental question. What does sovereignty mean in the modern era? International law rests on the principle that states govern themselves without external coercion. A U.S.-backed removal of a sitting government, even one accused of authoritarianism, would challenge that norm. Supporters might argue humanitarian justification. Critics would argue imperial overreach. The precedent would matter, because once the norm is broken, it becomes easier for others to follow. Global stability depends not just on power, but restraint. Part 7. Oil, energy, and economic realignment. Venezuela's oil reserves are among the largest in the world. Control over that resource carries immense strategic weight. Under U.S. influence, Venezuela's energy sector could be restructured. Sanctions might be lifted. Foreign investment could return. Production could increase. This would affect global oil prices, energy security, and geopolitical leverage. But it would also raise critical questions. Who benefits? Who controls revenue? What environmental protections exist? Oil has always shaped global politics. And where oil flows, power follows. Part 8. Economic shockwaves and market reactions. Markets react to uncertainty. A dramatic geopolitical shift in Venezuela would trigger volatility. Energy markets would fluctuate. Currencies could weaken or strengthen unpredictably. Investor confidence in emerging markets could decline. Countries dependent on Venezuelan oil or trade would scramble to adapt. Financial systems are deeply interconnected. What begins as a regional shock can quickly become global. Part 9. Culture, identity, and social consequences. Geopolitics is not just about states. It is about people. Foreign intervention often fractures national identity. Citizens become divided between competing narratives. Liberation versus occupation. Reform versus betrayal. Cultural resentment can linger for generations. Even if economic conditions improve, social cohesion may suffer. History shows that imposed solutions rarely heal quickly. Part 10. Precedent and the future of power. Perhaps the most significant impact of this hypothetical lies in precedent. If a major power openly reshapes another nation's leadership, global norms shift. Smaller nations feel more vulnerable. Rival powers feel more justified in similar actions. The international system becomes more transactional and less predictable. Power replaces principle. That is how instability spreads. Part 11. Could the United States avoid the worst outcomes? Even in this scenario, outcomes are not fixed. The long-term consequences would depend on choices made after the initial rupture. Would the U.S. prioritize multilateral cooperation? Would it respect Venezuelan self-determination? Would it rebuild institutions rather than control them? History suggests that restraint matters as much as strength. Part 12. Why this thought experiment matters. This scenario is unlikely in its most extreme form, but its value lies in what it reveals. It highlights how fragile global stability can be, how interconnected power has become, how quickly regional crises become global ones. It reminds us that modern geopolitics is not binary. It is layered, interdependent, and easily destabilized. Conclusion. The shadow of power. A hypothetical U.S. takeover of Venezuela would not simply change one country's future. It would reshape alliances, disrupt global markets, challenge international law, redefine sovereignty. This is not a story about personalities. It is a story about power. In a world already strained by climate change, economic inequality, and geopolitical rivalry, bold actions carry enormous consequences. Maps may look stable, borders may seem fixed, but history teaches us otherwise. The choices made today shape the world of tomorrow, and once power shifts, it rarely shifts back without cost.